Got really quiet. Well, welcome to the 4th symposium lecture. I've been instructed that the sign-up sheet for Core 150 extra credit is available over here. That'll be going around. If you want to be a little more virtuous, you can just pass that by without signing it. That'll be up to you. The Whitworth Symposium series is comprised of a series of lectures that are really designed to foster intellectual virtues on our campus and to heighten the status of Whitworth's intellectual vitality. This is a part of a larger project, but the lecture series really is the major bit of symposium. As a faculty member, I think I can speak for all the other faculty members here when I say this is a representation of all that's right about college. College students presenting their big ideas, interacting with their peers. I think this is just a terrific series. For tonight's discussion, I'm honored to introduce 2 speakers from Whitworth's philosophy department. Before I do that, important announcements. So the deadline for submission for the next symposium lecture is April 1st. That's for the April 30th lecture. And contact Sam Director if you're interested in submitting a proposal for that. Our first speaker is Jonathan Kim. Jonathan is a junior philosophy major from Seattle, Washington. He competes on Whitworth's debate team, and among his many accomplishments are a gold medal in the open division debate category at the last NCCFI. That's a national meeting, right? So we have a national champion. Earlier this year at the Fred Scheller Invitational at Pacific University, he finished a very impressive 2nd out of 150 total competitors in all divisions in speech. He's the 2013 recipient of the Whitworth Philosophy Department Essay Prize and will present his research on disagreement, some of the stuff I gather that we're going to hear from tonight, at the 18th Annual Undergraduate Philosophy Conference at Pacific University, as well as at the CERC Conference here in Spokane. His favorite philosophers include John Stuart Mill, Nietzsche, and Dr. Joshua Roscoe. His non-academic interests include tennis, soccer, the series House of Cards, and Ryan Gosling movies. He wrote that, I didn't. Our second speaker is Sarah Sauter. Sarah is also a philosophy major, also majoring in Spanish and French. She's currently a cultural diversity advocate in Errand Hall and participates in both Whitworth's intercollegiate forensics and ethics bowl teams. Some of her accolades include being a member of the National Championship Ethics Bowl team from 2012, and recently national champion at the NCCFI conference in communicational analysis and impromptu speaking. She's also an honors colloquium scholar, the winner of Whitworth's 2013-14 entry in the Elie Wiesel Ethics Prize contest. And I'm also told, that this is sort of off the record, that, will be on the record now, Sarah is director of all things female. So I was instructed to say that. I'm not sure what it means. There you have it. Okay, without further ado, please welcome our speakers.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
All right, cool. So first of all, quick thanks to Nate for that lovely introduction. And I also want to thank all of you for being here. I know it's midterms week and many of you are probably busy. And also I want to thank Symposium because, again, I want to repeat what Nate said, that I think it's a great forum for intellectual discussion, especially because it values presenting challenging ideas and not ideas that are already widely accepted or would be widely accepted if presented. And I think my particular topic today fits this category pretty well because I by no means expect consensus at the end of this presentation. So the topic that we're talking about today is the question in the philosophy of disagreement of how to respond when somebody disagrees with you. Specifically, when this dissenter is, as far as you know, just as smart as you, just as well informed, and just as well-meaning in terms of trying to get at the truth and convey that belief honestly. And in the literature, these are called disagreements between epistemic peers. And epistemic is just a fancy philosophical term for related to truth or knowledge or rationality. And henceforth, I will just refer to these kinds of disagreements as epistemic peer disagreements, or simply EPDs. And quickly, I want to talk about why it's important that we even ask this question in the first place. How do we respond to EPDs? And there are several reasons. And I think the first one is that it seems to obtain widely in reality, that EPDs exist all around us. I assume that most, if not all of us today here, have strong beliefs about controversial issues. Issues where it's not clear that one side dominates over the other. Issues where there seems to be a general parity between the contending sides, where there are smart people on both sides and that the line seems to be drawn relatively evenly down the middle. And no one side enjoys a preponderance of assent or acceptance. And some examples of these kinds of issues might be things like the question of whether God exists, the question of do humans have significant free will, and the question of whether human beings are essentially good or evil, and so on. And furthermore, another reason why this question is important to ask is because the response to which we give these issues seem to have significant practical implications. While some of these questions might be more abstract and unconsequential, like for example, the question of free will and the nature of consciousness, it's highly unlikely that the answers to these questions would impact the way we live our lives. But others are more practically relevant. For example, the moral status of fetuses, the issue of capital punishment, and other political disagreements. And finally, the third reason why this question is important is simply because of rationality. I assume that all of us want to be rational, and insofar as the question of how to respond to EPDs is the question of what the rational response is, it's important that we try to find an answer. And so with that, recognizing this importance, philosophers have developed two main approaches to answering this question. The first is a view called conciliationism, which basically states that in an EPD, you are rationally required to reduce confidence in your initial belief. Now, by rationality, I'm simply defining it in its standard form as conformity to evidence. And by reducing confidence, that might look like something like if you have initially 100% credence level to a belief, you might lower that to like a 50% credence level. And credence level simply means how likely do you think that the belief is true. And the second main approach to the question is the counterpart to conciliationism called the steadfast view. That's pretty self-explanatory. Basically just denies conciliationism and states that in an EPD, you can still remain rational without reducing confidence in your initial belief. And apparently there's a third view, which I overlooked, as shown in this poster, which is that in an EPD you're supposed to start a fight. Unfortunately, I haven't really explored that approach yet, but the one I will be exploring today and will develop and defend is a strong form of conciliationism called equal weight conciliationism. And this view basically states that in an EPD, you are rationally required to reduce confidence in your initial belief so as to give equal weight to your dissenter's belief, which often leads to what we call splitting the difference, which is basically averaging your two credence levels and meeting each other in the middle. Like for example, if you believe in a 50% credence level, your dissenter believes in 100%, you might go, settle for 75% or something like that. Or in other cases, mostly with sort of all or nothing types of beliefs, it might mean meeting each other in suspension, just going agnostic. So already we can kind of see the sort of skeptical implications that this view has. And in what follows, I'll basically develop the argument for this view. But before I do that, I want to first of all talk about the nature of disagreement so we have an exact idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about EPDs in the first place. And I'm going to start from like the basic, like foundational level, and it might seem a little trivial, but I promise it's relevant. There are a couple of things to note that are fundamental assumptions that are related to EPDs. The first thing is the existence of other minds. Now, when I look at you, I see a human figure, and I infer that there's a mind there with rational faculties. Pretty simple. I think everyone can agree with that. And the second thing, furthermore, with other minds, we recognize that other minds are essentially like ours. There's no essential difference. So there's no, in principle, reason to kind of privilege your mind over other people's minds. We all have the same rational faculties that are tools to try to get at truth, and so on. And the second fundamental assumption is fallibility. That we have made mistakes in the past, we'll probably make mistakes in the future, whether it's regards to inductive inferences, deductive inferences, inferences to best explanations, any type of rational process we do to try to get at truth. We don't have 100% reliability when it comes to our minds, our rational faculties, as tools at arriving at truth. So unless you're a solipsist who believes that your mind is the only mind that exists, or unless you think that you're God, you believe that there are other minds and that your minds are fallible. And so for the rest of us who aren't solipsists or God, we recognize from these two fundamental assumptions the fact that other people's beliefs have epistemic weight, that their beliefs influence the way we form our beliefs and should influence the way we form our beliefs. And we see this manifested in basically all areas of life. For example, whenever we form beliefs based on testimony, that's other people's epistemic weight in action. Whenever you get like a medical diagnosis and then get a second opinion from another doctor. In fact, any kind of expert opinion is an example of epistemic weight being given to other minds. Whenever we ask our peers to read and review our papers and give us feedback, that's us kind of assuming the epistemic weight of other people's beliefs. And so, but also we recognize that in certain circumstances we give more epistemic weight than others. That the amount of weight we give varies depending on certain factors. For example, if a toddler came up to me and said that he or she disagrees with me on some issue, I probably won't be that fazed. If someone I know who is a pathological liar tells me something, I probably will be hesitant. And this basically means that a person is sincere when that person is honestly trying to get at the truth. So this condition rules out liars and people we have reason to think are joking, for example. So when we return to the question of how do we respond to epistemic peer disagreements, we see that it's really a question of what to do in a situation where these three factors have a general parity between you and your dissenter, when there's equal cognitive skills, equal evidential extents, and equal sincerity. And so now that we know more of what epistemic peer disagreements really are, I'm going to turn to a paradigm example of an epistemic peer disagreement to kind of show where conciliationist intuitions kind of stem from. And the first example I'm going to talk about is a classic in the literature called the mental math case, first developed by David Christensen and here paraphrased by Graham Oppie. I'm just going to read this to you. A number of philosophers go out to dinner after a seminar. When it comes time to pay the bill, they all agree to a 15% tip plus rounding and to split the whole cost evenly between them. With the bill clearly visible to all, two of the members of the party calculate the individual shares of the bill. So this is basically establishing evidential peerhood and the question at hand. One calculates $63 and at this point is confident that each owes $63. So this is the initial belief of this person. Then, the other then tells the first that she has calculated $61. How should the first calculator react to this new information? Now, to make this an exact EPD, we had to add the fact that there's mutual knowledge that the group has a long history of eating out together, that the two in question always calculate the bill, and they're equally reliable at performing this calculation. Mostly they agree, but when they don't, neither is more likely than the other to have things correct, that neither is especially tired nor energetic, neither has consumed more coffee or wine, neither feels more confident than the other about the result of this particular calculation, and so forth. So this seems to be a pretty standard scenario of an EPD. And I think our rational intuition here is that the first calculator must reduce confidence, and that he or she cannot just assume that her calculation is more likely to be correct than the other person. And another example I want to talk about in addition to this is sort of an analogy that I think really helps to get across the point of our minds as sort of fallible tools at getting at truth. And I just call this the thermometer case. And I'm just going to talk about it. So if thermometers are tools to measure temperature, then our minds are like tools to get at the truth. And we could see in this example, let's say that you and a friend buy thermometers of the same model, and on the boxes the company discloses that this model has a 90% reliability with a margin of error of 3 degrees. You take out your thermometer and test the temperature of the room, and you get 70 degrees. At this point, you're pretty confident that the room is 70 degrees warm, because 90% reliability is not that bad. But then your friend tells you that she has gotten 75 degrees on her thermometer. Whereas otherwise you'd be fairly justified in being confident that the room is indeed 70 degrees Fahrenheit. What do you do in response to this new information that the other thermometer there's a discrepancy? And it seems like, again, the rational intuition is that you should reduce the confidence in the initial belief that the room is indeed 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It seems quite arbitrary to maintain that it is 70 degrees, that your thermometer is somehow more reliable, that you should give, and so instead we should give equal probability to the possibilities of the room being 70 degrees as well as 75 degrees. And so that's sort of where conciliationist intuitions stem from. And to really kind of crystallize the argument, in the founding spirit of Symposium, I have prepared a formal premise conclusion argument, step by step. And it's a little bit long, but that is for the sake of maximum clarity, so just bear with me here. Premise one. So this is a disagreement between artificial subjects S and R. If S is in an EPD with R regarding some question Q, then S and R have the same evidence, the same cognitive skills relevant to Q, and they are equally sincere. Premise two. If S and R have the same evidence and the cognitive skills relevant to Q, and they are equally sincere, then S and R are equally likely to get at the truth regarding Q. That seems to sort of just follow from definitions of what it means to be likely to be getting at truth. Premise three. If S is aware that she has no reason to think that S's belief is closer to the truth or is true than R's belief regarding Q, then S has no reason to give her belief epistemic privilege, essentially to think that her belief is more likely to be true. And that's just definitional as well. Premise four. If S is aware that she has no reason to think that S's belief regarding Q is closer to the truth or is true than R's belief regarding Q, then S has no, oh wait, no. Did I already read that? Yeah, I already read that, my bad. So premise 5. If S has no reason to give her belief regarding Q epistemic privilege, then for S to give her belief regarding Q epistemic privilege is arbitrary. That's just the definition of arbitrary. If you do something without a reason, then you're being arbitrary. Premise number 6. For S to remain steadfast in her belief regarding Q is for S to give it epistemic privilege, and that's just the definition of what it means to be steadfast. Premise number 7. This just follows from premise number 1 through 6. In order for S to avoid being arbitrary in an EPD with R regarding Q, then S must, oh wait, no, excuse me, that's premise 8. So 7. If S is in an EPD with R regarding Q, for S to remain steadfast in her belief regarding Q is arbitrary. So we're just connecting not giving equal weight with being arbitrary. Premise number 8, finally the conclusion. In order for S to avoid being arbitrary in an EPD with R regarding Q, S must not remain steadfast in her belief regarding Q. This is just the logical contraposition of 7 that are logically equivalent. And basically it means that in order for S to remain rational and not be arbitrary, she has to withhold from giving epistemic privilege to her own view. And that means reducing confidence in her initial view and giving equal weight to her dissenter's view. So that's the argument, and I want to quickly outline some things about it. Basically, it's really a simple argument despite the fact that it has 8 premises, and it's basically saying that if you're in an EPD, you're equally likely to be getting at the truth. And if you're equally likely to be getting at the truth, there's no reason to favor yours over the dissenters, and thus you must give equal weight. And the contraposition of this is that whenever you're in a disagreement and you withhold giving equal weight, then you logically are compelled to deny the fact that that an EPD obtains in that case, which leaves the following options. You can ascribe these following epistemic failures essentially to your dissenter. You can either say that your dissenter is in fact not a peer because she has inferior cognitive skills, or because she has inferior evidence, or because they're just not being as sincere, that maybe they're not being serious, or maybe they're being led by pragmatic reasons rather than epistemic reasons. Another thing about this argument is that it's purely analytic. The consequence follows just from the definition of the concept. So if it is true, then it is necessarily true. It doesn't depend on any contingent factor in the world. But the force by which this argument actually applies depends on empirical data. That is, do EPDs even obtain widely in reality? This is an important question to ask because if EPDs don't actually obtain widely in reality, then even if this argument is true, then it's uninteresting. It doesn't really matter to us. So we have to ask the question of whether EPDs really do obtain widely. And initially, at the beginning of the speech, I said that it seems like they do with all the examples that I set out. But it might still be pressed, like how can we tell when we are in an EPD? How can we tell that peerhood obtains in all three of these conditions? Cognitive skill, evidential skill, and sincerity. And so it leads to the question of what constitutes peerhood. And there are several ways to kind of approach this. And a bad way to answer this question is to say that you need identity of evidence and peer, cognitive skills, etc. And that's because that standard is just way too strong. First of all, it's impossible to be met. No one ever has identical evidence because we all have qualitatively different experiences. Even if, for example, in the mental math case, the bill is clearly visible to both calculators, they're technically not identical experiences because each qualitative experience is unique. So that would rule out paradigm cases, and so it obviously seems too strong and seems to go against our intuition that we still give epistemic weight to other people's beliefs, despite the fact that we don't have identical evidence or identical cognitive skill. So the standard that I propose is, and I basically just call it sufficient similarity. Sufficient for what? Sufficient enough to establish an equal likelihood at getting at truth. Now, this might seem like a truism, and it might seem like it's uninformative, but I think partly why this might be the best the conciliationists can do is because it's just sort of an irreducible concept. And there is no clear calculus that can tell us at what point enough similarities obtain so that it meets the threshold of peerhood that allows for conciliationist implications to obtain. But however, there is a helpful guideline I think we can use, despite the fact that peerhood is hard to identify. And this is, I just simply call this the denial test. Whenever you're in a disagreement, ask yourself whether you feel comfortable or you feel justified in attributing one of the three or more epistemic failures to your dissenter. If you're in a disagreement with a person, if you're not prepared to say that your dissenter is a cognitive inferior, or an evidential inferior, or is less sincere than you, I think that gives us a pretty good indication that you are in fact in an EPD and that conciliationist implications do apply. But even if this is still kind of vague, conciliationism can still point to the fact that epistemic superiors are much more easier to pinpoint. And as long as there seems to be a general parity between dissenting epistemic superiors within issues, I think conciliationist implications could still apply. And this point about, and in fact, when epistemic superior disagrees with you, it seems like you might not even merely be compelled to give equal weight, but you might be compelled to give even more weight than just equal, because that person is probably more likely to be right. Superiors and superiors, as well as peers, that the degree to which you adjust your initial belief is proportionate to the general holistic epistemic comparison. And it reflects the fact that in reality, disagreements are usually not just one-on-one peer disagreements. They usually have multiple parties and have multiple sides because often there are more than two ways to answer a question, as well as varying levels of epistemic competence. But so, nonetheless, if everything that I said is up to now is true, then we can clearly see that wide skeptical implications follow, and we can see this in the argument applied. Premise number 9. It is the case that for many of us, epistemic peer disagreements obtain in many areas of belief, whether philosophical, religious, or political, etc. Premise number 10. In order for many of us to avoid being arbitrary, we must not remain steadfast in those areas of belief and reduce confidence so as to give equal weight to our epistemic peers. usually resulting in suspension of belief. Now, obviously, asking someone to let go of their deeply held, cherished religious beliefs, philosophical beliefs, or political beliefs is a pretty controversial thing to ask. That's a lot to demand. So, not surprisingly, a lot of people have pushed back on conciliationism and offered many objections. And here I'm just going to cover a couple of them. The first objection is not so much philosophical as more what I expected, but to be just kind of a popular emotional response. And it's that skepticism is stifling, that we don't want skepticism to be a conclusion. And since equal weight conciliationism implies skepticism, equal weight conciliationism should be suspect. And I have several responses to this, and I think this kind of a response is sort of tied in with a myth of skepticism that kind of misunderstands what skepticism really is. And the first response is simply that skepticism, or suspending belief, doesn't at all foreclose progress. There's no necessary conclusion that if you suspend belief, that you have to all of a sudden lose all your curiosity, that you all of a sudden have to stop investigating and try to find out the truth. In fact, skeptical implications might even inspire you to look for more answers so as to try and achieve a final consensus. The second response to this objection is that skepticism doesn't foreclose action. Many people think that, if you're skeptical about things like the existence of the external world or other minds, then you're doomed to just kind of sitting in your house and doing nothing. However, that's simply not the case. For example, if I flip a coin behind my back and ask you to bet on heads or tails, and I tell you that if you bet on heads and you're right, I'll give you $1 million. If you bet on tails and you're right, I'll give you just $1. What will you do? You'll probably bet on heads, despite the fact that you're not justified in believing either one of them. You have to suspend belief with regards to what you think is the actual outcome, but you could still take the bet. Third response to this objection is that I think there's something extremely right in the Socratic value of acknowledging that the Socratic value of knowing that you don't know. Sometimes sometimes rationality compels skepticism. And insofar as we want to be rational, if rationality says you've got to suspend belief, then there's really no argument with it. Again, if I flip a coin behind my back and ask you, is it heads or tails? Rationality compels you to withhold belief. You've got to say both are equally likely. Now, the second objection is a little more philosophical. I'm not going to be able to do justice to it, nor in my response, but I think it's good to be aware of it. And this objection states that in a case of an EPD, when it seems like there's peerhood, why can't we say that the peer has just made a mistake in this case, even though he or she is usually reliable? But we all know even professional soccer players sometimes miss penalty kicks. It happens. Mistakes happen. So why can't we say that in this case, the peer has made a mistake, and so we're able to still steadfast in our initial belief? And my response to this is that, well, there are two reasons why someone might try to go with this recourse. There are two reasons why you might think that the peer has made a mistake. One is reasons independent of the disagreement itself. For example, it might seem like the person is unusually tired in this circumstance, or the person is visibly drunk. The second reason is that the motivation to think that the person has made a mistake stems solely from the fact that there's a disagreement. Now, I think both of these reasons end up kind of favoring conciliationism in the end. For example, first reason, if there's a reason independent of the disagreement itself that makes you think that the peer has made a mistake, then at that moment you have violated the condition of peerhood and it's no longer an EPD to begin with. If the person is visibly drunk, then you're no longer justified in thinking that that person is equally likely to be getting at the truth in this occasion. So while we can make a distinction between performance and competence, there's no reason EPDs or conciliationism is only concerned with, in this case, what are you justified in believing is the reliability of you as well as your peer. The second reason, if the motivation to think that this person has made a mistake stems solely from the fact that she or he is disagreeing with you, then it's clearly arbitrary for you to think that this person has made a mistake and that it's not you who has made a mistake. If we're starting with the assumption that you and your dissenter are both equally reliable at getting at the truth, then what room is there for you to say that you're actually more likely in this case? Go back to the thermometer example. If you state that, well, maybe that the other person's thermometer is, actually being wrong and mine happens to be right in this case. However, if there's no independent reason to think that the other thermometer is especially subject to malfunctioning in this case, then there's no room for you to privilege your thermometer over your peers. And finally, the claim that equal weight conciliationism is self-defeating. And I think this is the most attractive objection, as self-defeat indeed seems to be a pretty damning kind of characteristic to have for any view. However, there have been many professional philosophers who have responded in defense of conciliation against the self-defeat claim. And our objection basically goes like this. If an epistemic disagreement obtains over the truth or falsehood of equal weight conciliationism itself, then equal weight conciliationism might advise for its own rejection, and therefore give contradictory advice. Because if it at first said that you should reduce confidence in this belief here, but then takes away your initial reason for doing that in the first place by suspending belief on equal weight conciliationism, then the principle is essentially asking you to do two contradictory things at the same time. And insofar as the principle does that, it is presumed that the principle is in trouble. Now, I think this objection is well summarized by David Christensen here, who states that several people have noted that, at least given the current state of epistemological opinion, there's a sense in which conciliationism is self-undermining. For example, I as a conciliationist know full well that several excellent philosophers oppose my view. In fact, it seems to me that opinion on conciliationism is presently divided roughly evenly. By my own lights, then, I should not be highly confident in my conciliationism. So in a sense, my conciliationism is self-undermining. Now, however, there are multiple ways to interpret what this objection really means, and I think it's good for us to make some distinctions. The first distinction is between automatically self-defeating principles versus potentially self-defeating principles. Automatically defeating principles are principles that defeat themselves in all circumstances. And potentially defeating principles are those that defeat themselves only on certain circumstances. Second distinction, potentially versus actually defeating principles. So this is basically a question of whether the principle is self-defeating in our circumstance right now, not just some possible circumstance, but in our reality right now. And finally, the third distinction is grounds for falsehood versus grounds for rejection. An objection can give you a reason to reject a belief without giving you a reason to think that it's false. Again, if I flip a coin behind my back, you have reason to think, you have reason to suspend belief and reject the view that it is in fact heads. But you have no reason to think that it is in fact not heads. You suspend belief. So there's an important distinction there. And when we apply all these distinctions to the self-defeat objection as applied to conciliationism, we see that the initial objection ends up being a little less worrisome than it might first appear. First, because conciliationism is obviously not automatically self-defeating. We can imagine a scenario where nobody disagrees over the issue of conciliationism itself. It's possible. So there are possible circumstances where it is not self-defeating. So we don't have to worry about automatically, the category of automatically defeating principles at all. Second distinction, potentially self-defeating principles. We can see that equal weight conciliationism is potentially at least self-defeating. Now we can ask ourselves, what does this mean if the principle is potentially self-defeating? Does it give us grounds for falsehood, grounds for rejection? However, upon reflection, we can see that by no means does the mere potentiality of defeating itself give grounds for falsehood for a principle. For example, we could take a look at this example, which I'll just call the hunch principle. And it goes, for any person S, any proposition P at any time T, if S's belief that P at T is entirely the result of a hunch, then S's belief that P at T is not justified. In other words, if you come to believe something on a hunch, you're not justified. You have to have other additional reasons for it. This is a potentially self-defeating principle because someone could, in some scenario, come to believe this principle entirely on a hunch. So this principle is potentially self-defeating. However, I think all of us would recognize that this principle is in fact true, that may be even necessarily true, derived from the definition of rationality. And so by no means does potential self-defeat entail falsehood. So then we can ask ourselves whether potential self-defeat entails grounds for rejection. And already we can see with this example that this principle is potentially self-defeating, but it doesn't give us grounds for rejection. We still believe in this principle. So it comes to our final distinction, actually self-defeating principles. If it is really the case, and David Christensen is right, that self-defeating principles in our circumstance, conciliationism in our circumstance right now is self-defeating because there's an even divide of dissenters, then does that give us grounds for falsehood? And my response to this is that no, it doesn't seem to, because we can easily imagine that all the conciliationists get so angry.
I would ask what the conciliation would advise us to do. And my final challenge has to do with self-defeat, and it's just a question that I would like to ask John. John holds very convictedly to his conciliationist belief, and I admire him for that. Yet he is aware of the existence of an epistemic peer and superiors out there who disagree with him. Think of Thomas Kelly from Princeton University, or Jennifer Lackey from Northwestern, or even our own Dr. Nate King, who is a leading voice in the field. He is aware of this disagreement and yet remains steadfast in his belief. This just shows the intuitiveness of steadfastness in certain situations. And so I would just like to ask John, are you willing to take your own deniability test? Are you willing to ascribe either cognitive or epistemic inferiority to your philosophy professor? Or perhaps non-seriousness toward his achieving toward the truth? I look forward to hearing what you have to say. There's one quotation that adequately summarizes the steadfast view that I've represented, and it is this: truth does not become more true by the virtue of the fact that the entire world agrees with it, nor less so, even if the whole world disagrees with it. Thank you.
So there was a lot that was said there, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to give a thorough response to each and every one of them, but quickly I'll try to touch upon every important thing that was said. So defense of conciliationism. The whole point about doxastic voluntarism and that sometimes we are unable to change our beliefs. I think with regards to that, we have to be careful that our fidelity to our initial beliefs can sometimes be really strong. So as to kind of give off a strong appeal to holding steadfast. And oftentimes that appeal is masked by pragmatic benefits. For a lot of us, it's inconvenient for us to suddenly change the way we live or change the way we think. But obviously these are not epistemic reasons. And so doxastic voluntarism really kind of depends on whether you are rationally, regardless of whether you are unable to change your mind a lot or not. That doesn't change the fact whether you changing your mind is a rational thing to do or not. And conciliationism is really only concerned with how should we rationally respond to EPDs. So if somebody tells me, well, even though I know that EPDs obtained in this case, even though I know that conciliationism is true, I just can't let go of my initial belief. I don't think that's much of a problem so much in conciliationism as much as it is in that person who's unable to let go of that fidelity. Secondly, the sort of appealing to private evidence to kind of avoid epistemic peer disagreements in general. While I do believe that there's, in a lot of cases, private evidence that's unique only to the individuals and that cannot be shared with other peers, that these kinds of evidence do exist. However, I think a lot of the things that conciliationism is concerned with don't have to do with private evidence. For example, questions like whether does free will exist or whether fetuses have moral status and stuff like that. Does that in any way depend on what kind of an experience you have? I feel like it'd be a kind of a stretch to say that I had a certain qualitative experience, I can't communicate with you, but that's the reason why I have to believe this way, and that nothing else in the world can persuade me otherwise. So again, I think this sort of initial fidelity to beliefs is something that can be a very strong hold, but have little epistemic weight when it comes to trying to do what is most rational. Especially because private evidence, a lot of that just kind of applies to mostly mind-dependent facts that are not really at dispute among people. For example, like the fact that I feel happy. If I state that, no one's probably going to disagree with me. And that is an example of private evidence giving me justification to believe in something despite what anybody else might say. But those are not the types of issues that we have epistemic disagreements over. So I think the conciliationists would not really be hard-pressed in response to this objection. And also, I really like the examples of Star Trek and Lucy, where it seems that even if people disagree with us, it seems like sometimes we might be rational in holding steadfast to our view. However, I think there are some relevant disanalogies between Lucy and Star Trek and the types of disagreements that conciliationism is concerned with. Because in Star Trek and Lucy, it didn't seem like that was a genuine case of an epistemic peer disagreement. Lucy's siblings didn't see the same thing that Lucy saw. There's a disconnect between the evidential parity there. You might even say there's a disconnect between sincerity there, or the sincere, honest attempt at getting at truth there. And furthermore, even if something like just sight perception seems to kind of compel us with very, very good reasons to believe what we saw, even if somebody disagrees, if we tweak the scenario a little bit and say that both people are in the room, one person sees something but the other person doesn't, and as far as they know, they are equally likely to be right in terms of reliability, just in general, then it seems like a different situation, because this situation is now an epistemic peer disagreement. It seems like if Lucy was one of the people there, she wouldn't be so quick to think that, I think what I saw was actually there. Even if you, who's standing right next to me, and who, as far as I know, is just as smart and just as well-meaning, didn't see what I think I saw. Maybe she might be suspecting that I, hallucinated, or some other psychological abnormality on her part. And the fourth point about pragmatic encroachment is very interesting, I think, because it talks about outcomes that are belief-dependent. And quickly, in response, I just want to kind of point out that even if for these kinds of beliefs, conciliationism might not apply so neatly as it does to other kinds of disagreements, it seems like the category of these kinds of beliefs is fairly narrow, that they don't really apply to a lot of the things that the conciliation is concerned with. For example, maybe the conciliation is okay with a person dying on his deathbed to believe that he will make it longer than he is justified in initially believing. And furthermore, Sarah has brought up the point about doxastic voluntarism, that we can't always just choose what to believe. And if that is the case, then what kind of an influence can Pascal's wager have on us that says you should choose to believe in God because that gives you more beneficial outcomes? If we can't just choose what we believe, especially if that belief is not for rational reasons, but for pragmatic reasons, then it seems that it's more difficult for us to kind of follow that advice. And in fact, following that advice might even be committing self-deception or something like that. I can't remember what was the fifth thing you said, sorry?
Are you willing to?
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, I was thinking I might avoid that one. Yeah, that's a really good point. And it just kind of points back to self-defeat. And I guess my response to that would be simply that if the responses to self-defeat succeed, and that conciliationism is really self-exempting, then regardless of if there's an EPD that obtains over conciliationism itself, I'm not actually rationally compelled to give equal weight, even by conciliationism itself, if the self-defeat objection, of course, could be overcome. But that's a broader question. So it all just kind of comes down to how well conciliationism can do against its objections. And if it turns out that it can't, then I sincerely apologize to Nate and Josh and Sarah for having steadfast in my conciliationism when I was rationally, well, then I'd be kind of feeling conciliationism again. But when conciliationism basically doesn't work. But again, you could already kind of see conciliationist intuitions applying even in the face of its self-defeat. Because all of a sudden, then now I feel more compelled to think that maybe the steadfast people will have it right that I don't. So those are my responses. Q&A, right? Okay. I apologize for going on a little bit. Mark?
I don't want to override other people. I have a few questions.
Sure.
But the first one I'll ask is just clarifying. For an EPD, do you have to be actually in a conversation with somebody who is in a disagreement, or do you just have to be aware of somebody who disagrees with you, or do you just have to be aware of the possibility of somebody who disagrees with you?
The possibility point might have some relevance, but as the conciliationist argument that I presented stands now, it is only concerned with awareness of a peer, of an epistemic peer. So it's not like you have to be actively discussing. It's just awareness of the existence of the peer that disagrees, then the implications follow from the conciliationist.
Great. This might just be an offshoot of pragmatic encroachment, so if it is, just say that. Would you say that different beliefs have different weight based on something other than, like, is the epistemic weight of a belief based on more than just whether or not it's true and justified? Like, are there other factors that need to go in? So an example being, one thing we read in epistemology was about the train example and whether or not you're late for a train. But you have more reason to be on time or to be concerned, and so that means you're more epistemically responsible.
I think that kind of points back to pragmatic factors playing a part in what you should do or believe. And at least from my perspective, I like to split the line between pragmatic justifications and epistemic justifications pretty sharply. And I think that as far as rationality is concerned, the only factors that matter are epistemic factors. Because whether you want something to be true or not, or whether something is more important to you or not, doesn't have any impact on whether something is more likely to be true or not. The only thing that weighs in that is our reasons. In other words, epistemic factors. So in my opinion, no, epistemic factors are the only factors I think that tie into rationality, just generally speaking. Now, the pragmatic encroachment example of the person on his or her deathbed, I think there's a narrow category that has special kind of analysis to be done there. But I think in general, just epistemic factors are what's relevant.
And as a follow-up to that, do you not think it's the case that most of our beliefs have non-epistemic reasons supporting those beliefs, or fact any of that? And if so, how would you disconnect those influences from holding a belief?
I think if I imagine a person who's trying to be as rational as possible, and he or she reflects on the fact that some of these beliefs I hold for not epistemic reasons, but pragmatic factors or non-epistemic factors, I think that person is rationally compelled to basically readjust their beliefs, having excluded the non-epistemic factors. Now, it could be a matter of debate whether what is an epistemic factor and what isn't. And so that would determine how much someone is impacted, or burdened. Rebecca?
What do you do? So there are some things like in scientific discovery where people see the exact same evidence as you and almost everybody disagrees with you, or let's say everybody disagrees with you. So by your calculation, if I see something and everybody else disagrees with me, everybody else is 100% correct, I should reduce my confidence to 0%, right? If they were 100% confident and we split the difference, everybody disagrees with me. But there's been examples where, like in the discovery of prions, where people saw the same evidence and one guy said, no, you're wrong, and he turned out to be right.
Yeah.
But if we accepted conciliationism, he really would have no justification to go on believing.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think that ties into what Sarah said about sometimes our beliefs turn out to be right, even if they weren't the popular ones.
Yeah.
And that's true. But I think the conciliationists would just simply reply that, you know, we're just concerned with believing what is most rational to believe, because what is most rational to believe tends to be the true option. It isn't always the true outcome. And so, you know, sometimes we have anomalies in history where, you know, someone who has almost no knowledge in the field kind of makes a guess, turns out to be right, even when all the people who are, you know, experts in the field turn out to be wrong. You know, that could also happen as well. But we wouldn't all of a sudden say that that's the reason why we should give epistemic weight to epistemic superiors. And so I think it's an important distinction to make between truth and rationality. The point is that, again, going back to the fallibility point, the assumption that we don't have 100% reliability. So the best we can do is just choose what is most likely to be true, or choose what we're most justified in believing at this point. And sometimes rationality compels suspension, and if that's what rationality says, then regardless of whether down the road it turns out to be false, well, that's too bad, but you can't, I don't think you can blame the person for having conceded this or epistemic weight. If the conciliationist argument is sound, then that's what rationality means. So yeah.
Right. So I'm thinking of an example where the pragmatic factors become epistemic factors. So think about this disagreement that perhaps you and I might have between Kantian ethics and utilitarian ethics, in which the Kantian says lying is categorically impermissible. So we take the classic example of the Nazis at your door asking if you're hiding Jews. You, John, are in fact hiding Jews. And Kantian ethics in this situation says, don't tell the truth, but certainly don't lie. Utilitarian ethics says, go ahead and lie, right? We've established an EPD between John Stuart Mill and Kant, maybe you and me, I don't know who it is in this situation. But it seems that there are pragmatic factors, right? If you establish the EPD and you go, if you remain steadfast for Kant, and it turns out that utilitarianism is in fact true, you've done a greater harm to morality because you obeyed a duty that turned out to be false, which led to this terrible, terrible consequence of Jews being killed. So what if there are certain pragmatic factors that, given the truth of one theory, make it so that even if we suspend judgment, we have to go for one, because pragmatically speaking, we do a greater wrong to morality if we don't go that way.
So scenarios where there's equal likelihood, essentially, because of EPD, but there's more at stake on this side.
Yeah, and at what point do those pragmatic factors, not just pragmatic factors, simpliciter, but at what point do they become epistemic factors that make us more rational in believing one way?
I think I would just respond by going back to one of my responses to skepticism, that suspension doesn't foreclose action. That you could still believe there's a 50-50% chance between these two issues. But if you just recognize, well, you know, I have no reason to believe that one is more true than the other, but there could still be other factors that tie into the way you act. So maybe if you recognize that there's more at stake here than there, then you might just act in accordance to this side. But the moment where you give that side more epistemic weight, more likelihood of being true, then conciliationism would say you're being irrational. But conciliationism doesn't foreclose you acting in 50-50 situations, and you can still be rational of doing that. Anything else? Josh.
Okay, so this is a outlandish thought experiment. Just bear with me for a minute. Okay, so I listen to NPR all the time, and I hear this broadcast saying that the first sign of mental delusion is when you're unable to perform simple arithmetic very well. you and I are on a plane, like a Malaysia plane, we crash, and you and I are now on a desert island. And I'm terrified about what's going to happen. You and I are struggling for food. We're there for a long time. We're hungry. And then all of a sudden, after 4 weeks on this island, we're trying to figure out how to rebuild the craft, and we come across this simple arithmetic problem, 20 plus 21 or something like that. I say, oh, it's 41. You say it's 43. And then I think about the NPR thing, and I think, oh, John's losing it. Here's the question, I guess. Under conciliationism, at least the equal weight, can I never figure that out, like whether you're losing it or whether I'm losing it, even though I keep thinking to myself, 20 plus 21 is 41. Okay, but here's John, he's saying it's 43. So just the question, like, when can you, under those circumstances, downgrade the other?
So I guess it would depend on the analysis of whether that is a genuine EPD or not. And just to fill in some holes, I guess, it might seem like it is not an EPD, simply because you might have reasons independent of the disagreement to expect me to start losing it. Because we're aware that we're in a desert, we haven't really eaten.
I also expect me.
Yeah, you as well. And also the fact that, I'm probably showing signs of losing it before I actually, try to do the math problem. So unless all of those can be filled in to say that, well, none of those actually obtained, that I was looking perfectly fine, and then all of a sudden I say, oh no, it's 42, not 41. Yeah. Then I guess, in that case, considering the fact that a person under delusion would probably be as certain of a mistake as someone who isn't under delusion is, as much as you might be certain in a normal circumstance that 20 plus 21 is 41. A person under delusion who thinks that it's 42 would probably have the same sort of strength behind or confidence in that belief, no matter how widely wrong it is. So, given those assumptions, I think if there is, and as a conciliationist, I'm just going to bite the bullet here and say that you have to actually reduce confidence and say that 20 plus 21 is not 41, or 41 in that circumstance. Because you have reason to believe that you're being delusional, losing it, as much as the other person is. And so, just conceptually, if it's a genuine EPD, it's no different in any way than another disagreement with something a lot more uncertain, a lot more uncertain than basic arithmetic. And an additional response, because biting the bullet isn't always the most favorable one, is some conciliationists, like John Pittard, have argued as a way to avoid the self-defeating objection that beliefs that are arrived at purely analytically aren't subject to conciliationist implications. So all math problems, simple arithmetic, are no longer subject to conciliationist implications, and which simply follow from his attempt to say that conciliationism isn't subject to conciliationist implications because it's purely analytic. So that would be a way, but the conciliationist would lose a lot of ground in what types of issues are subject to conciliationist implications. I'm not so fine with that, so I'd rather stick with biting the bullet. But I know it's very counterintuitive, so that is, I guess, a good weakness to point out in conciliations.
Going back to Sam's example, your response was more or less, correct me if I'm wrong, you can still hold a suspension of belief but act in whatever way seems pragmatic in the situation.
Yeah.
What then is the significance of suspending belief or holding belief if your actions are independent of that?
Just rationality. Like, for example,
what significance of being intellectually rational when you're not acting rationally? Because that action would no longer be rational, it would be arbitrary, right?
Well, I think it's a fair assumption that rationality only applies to belief states, and that actions can be done irrationally, under irrational beliefs as well as rational beliefs, even if it's the same action. And so I would just say that being rational just has intrinsic value as human beings. That, and just if you go back to my coin example, if I put the coin behind my back, but getting it right on heads gives you $1 million as opposed to $1 on tails, you obviously have reasons to bet heads. Does that mean that you should believe that it's heads? Something about believing that it's heads in that situation seems to kind of, cross rationalism. Simply because there are no reasons to.
Alright, I think we're out of time. We can
Oh, yeah.
continue the discussion afterwards. If you guys want the Core 50 thing, it's just right over there. I can go grab it after this, but thank John.
Thank you. All of a sudden, there is no disagreement over conciliationism itself. And all of a sudden, conciliationism is true again by lights of this objection independently. However, we've already stated that if this principle is true, it is necessarily true. So the fact that this principle might kind of weave in and out of truth and falsehood seems to be just incompatible with what we know about conciliationism. So it must not be the case that mere actual self-defeat entails falsehood, because the truth or falsity of conciliation